Hello. So one of the ways I like to use the Gemini, it's a rack module. It's really either this one or the Dexabel SX8. I forget what it's called. But the Dexabel one and the GSi one, those are really good modules. They got some good engines in them. Anyways, you can USB to this guy because he's got the big beefy Type B USB port in the back. And then, instead of relying on the wireless, you can use the editor. In the editor, you can pick a bunch of sounds. So I like, um, in music, playing mostly like velocity sensitive stuff. So that'll be your tine pianos and reed pianos, and then your acoustic pianos. Those are the funnest instruments. But then there's the instruments that are less about velocity, like touch response, and more like an on-off switch where it's just on or it's off, depending on whether you press the key or not. And that's usually going to be an organ and a synth, at least for me. So it's a little bit different kind of music, and I think that it kind of lends itself differently to what kind of music you play. But I do like to have an organ in the right hand and like a synth bass in the left hand. And so it's got dual DSPs, so it can do two sounds from each one of these engines at the same time. So like DSP1 down here, I have for the tone wheel organ. That's like the Hammond thing, right? So you've got all the drawbars. So um, if it, because it's just a rack unit, you have to have a way to control the drawbars. So this is the best MIDI controller for the Gemini organ, which is called the VB3-2, second version, I guess. So this has the 9 drawbars, and then it has a few other functions for that you see typically on a Hammond organ, for the percussion and the vibrato and the chorus and the type and on and off, and then for the Leslie the speed, then and it has the blinky LEDs that kind of pulse in unison with what the sound is doing. And then you have a few other controls that might find useful: volume, drive, reverb, and click. And then you MIDI it out from the little TS port. You need an adapter. I think it's type B, but don't quote me on that. It's a TRS on 1/8 inch. It sticks into the back of this, and then you can, oops, take a MIDI cable out from there and just plug it into your GSi module. This thing, right on the back of there. There's 2 ports for that. Luckily, there's 2. I wish there were like 3 or 4, because in order to use it effectively without an editor and to have a bunch of real-time control, then you're going to need a bunch of different controllers to use it with. It's really simpler just to get uh, an organ that has its keys and has its drawbars all built into one device. But if you had to use a device with controllers, this is the thing to go for. It's powered by USB micro, so that's unfortunate, because you wish it was mini or just regular USB type A, but it's micro, so watch out for that. Um, but yeah, that's how it gets its power. And yeah, you could do your big organ swells and your deep purples and your Keith Emersons and all the cool stuff from there. Now, what this has a predefined set of MIDI CC values that it sends out. So what you would do is off into here, you would like go to your MIDI map, and we can take a look, see how it has. Whoops, got to switch to this. See how it has on the MIDI map this is the drawbar for 16. That's MIDI CC 12. And it goes up from there for 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, all through there, right? So, um, so this one right here for 16 sends out MIDI values on CC's 12. So you put in 12 for that one, right? and then you go down from there. And so then when you get to the engine, when you pull this drawbar, the lowest one, all the way out or push it in, then that will match up with the sound on what it's doing. It'll move this drawbar, and it's an like Korg does it by a step of 9 values. This one scales it, so it has the full 127 values. It's not like it has that many different settings on the organ itself, but it just scales it so that it runs smoothly when you pull the drawbar out and push it in. And then there's a knob for the key click, so you can control that. And there's the knob for the buttons for the turning on and off the vibrato and the key click and stuff. But you'll notice that there's also a few other things that don't belong to the organ, like the drive and the reverb knobs in the middle, and the volume knob. So that would be tied to not in the engine, but in the effects. So the volume knob would be controlling this one here. So you've got to set the volume in your MIDI map to be whatever this one spits out. I think it's MIDI CC7. That's usually what volume is. And then drive will be here under the rotary simulator, under this one. This it says drive. And then you'll have to map the buttons so that they match up with the rotary switch to go fast and slow. That's the most commonly used setting. And then there's a knob for reverb, right? So you can map it to level to see how much washy reverb effect you get. So that's a cool thing, is this device here. To edit the actual numbers that these controls spit out would require a little bit of computer know-how, USBing this to your computer, but it can be done. But by default, hopefully that's all set up anyway. But yeah, you might have to change settings on the Gemini so that it reacts to the controls respectively. Now on DSP2, that's when you might pick like the VA synth, right? The GVA-1, and that system runs a bit differently. It's a 2 oscillator synth. So you would, instead of clicking the tone wheel organ, you come down here and select whatever synth you want. But I was thinking, what if you had a controller just like the one I showed you, but for the synth engine instead? So to have a look at this, you have 2 oscillators, and you can mix in a saw wave and a square wave and a triangle wave all simultaneously. So it's not like one is active and then the other one has to come down. They can all be on if you want to. And that goes the same for oscillator 2. So if you wanted kind of like an Odyssey sound, you might put it in mono setting and then have the saw wave for oscillator 2 and the square wave for oscillator 1. And then you would, in the mixer section, which is here, the oscillator level for oscillator 1 and 2. That's just what you have. And then there's a sub oscillator for oscillator 1, and then there is a fine tune for oscillator 2. And that sits in the middle happily at 64, because that's in the middle of 0 to 127 values there. And so there isn't an adequate hardware controller for this engine yet. I did kind of see one on GSi's Facebook page, but I think that's this engine inside a hardware box, and it doesn't send out MIDI. It only receives MIDI, so you can't even control the own engine with its own controller. But that's an aside. That's not actually a thing yet. The closest I've seen that I've come up with is probably like an Odyssey would be closest, but an Odyssey doesn't send out MIDI information when you mess with its sliders. This Boutique version does. So you have a bunch of sliders here, and all of the Rolands, I think, all of them, maybe all of them, they actually send out CC values when you move these sliders, which is super helpful. And so the architecture of a SH-01, well, this is the SH Boutique version, so it's the 01A. It has kind of the same thing going on. It's only one oscillator, but you're able to mix in a square wave and a sawtooth wave and a sub oscillator simultaneously. So you can do that all, and then it has your filter and your envelope, and that's pretty much it. Super simple, but it could be a decent controller. So because this is on DSP2, that mean that you can switch this to a different MIDI channel, right? So the organ will be on MIDI channel 1, and the synthesizer will be on MIDI channel 4 on the second DSP. So that means, like, if this drawbar spits out CC12, it could be that this slider also spits out CC12. There's a conflict there, but that's taken care of because both engines are on separate MIDI channels. So this CC12 won't interfere with the organ CC12. So it's not like you're going to be pulling out a drawbar when you want to edit something on your synthesizer voice, since it's on its own channel. This would be channel 4, organ on channel 1. You can have the same MIDI channel or the same MIDI CC messages, the same numbers in use. So that's cool. And that's also obvious, I think. So, anyways, this isn't the perfect thing. Like, as we can see, there's a saw level, and there's a square level, and there's a triangle, but there's no triangle on this thing. So you could just not have triangle, just not make use of it. Let me see if I can demonstrate a little bit of what this will sound like. Because otherwise, if you don't have this, you could just use a Behringer, or you could use one of those Korg Nano controls with the sliders and the knobs and the buttons. That would be effective. That would be effective. But if you want all your controls to be named so that you never get them mixed up, this will be one way to do it. So let me see if I can hear what. Sorry, I look kind of silly. Okay. Oh, can you hear that? I don't even know what that is. um, so yeah, it's really cool to have a controller for the Gemini synth, because that's one of its many engines inside of it. And this is the thing: you don't need this keyboard; it's kind of rinky-dink. You just take the module and use it as a controller. As you can see, I'm pressing a key, and we're hearing the Gemini rack, which I explained in a few videos, which is this thing here. The Gemini rack. This is the thing that you're hearing, making those beeps and boops. As I only have power over USB and a MIDI cable, so there's no audio coming out of this thing. Just want to clarify that. So yeah, if you want to close down the filter a bit. Oof. Highly resonant. Then yeah, you could have you could program a real-time basic. And then you could have this switch be toggling between mono and poly modes. So that we can play a chord. Oop, that's the wrong one. And then mono mode, right? And mono mode, even though you can't play a chord, it's it's very important to have those two modes on hand. So you just this little something, and then we have rates for the LFO. Now, one thing to note is that this engine itself, the Roland engine here, it can transpose, so it can come down an octave or up an octave, but the setting on here doesn't apply to the MIDI information going out from the keyboard. So this key will always trigger like C4 on the Gemini, no matter what octave setting you have inside the menu. So what you'll have to do then is dedicate one of these sliders maybe to the tune option, the semitone. So that would be right, because so if you were programming a bass synth, C4 is too high. You got to hit those low frequencies. So that would mean going into the synth, or maybe I don't know, whichever slider you're not really using. Like, forget about the sub oscillator. Just make this your coarse, your semitone coarse tuning for both oscillators, right? So, and then that will get you in the lower register. That is if you're using this keyboard. Again, you don't need to use this keyboard. So, because this keyboard doesn't have an octave up or down button, then you won't run into that problem, because most other MIDI controllers do have that button, and then that'll be your octave. So that's just something to look out for if you're actually using this KM25, which is just terrible, really. This is the mini keys and it's 2 octaves, and I don't know why you'd ever use it. And it doesn't have aftertouch anyway. And as we can see on this synthesizer, one of your mod sources is aftertouch, along with expression pedal and mod wheel and LFOs. So if you want to make the use of this synthesizer, you gotta tie something to aftertouch in the mod matrices, right? So, anyways, so what I've done is that if we go into the map, right, and we look about through here, scrolling down to the bottom, yeah, here we go. So oscillator 1 is saw level, and to control that is CC20. But I've also made oscillator 2's saw level CC20. So really, when I put slide the slider for the sawtooth, that will be manipulating both of these sliders, which, it's a compromise, because I only have one oscillator on the controller, but there's 2 oscillators here. I just map them to the same CC so that they both turn up or turn down, depending on what I send them to. And then one neat thing is that this knob right here for the fine tune, that also sends MIDI CC value. So even though I have the sound, the saw waves being the same level, it is nice if you detune it. Don't detune it too much, of course, because then it sounds less good. But if you detune it just a little bit, what that's doing is that it's controlling oscillator 2's fine tune, and it's just moving it out of that happy 64 middle up or down a little bit, not to the extremes, but just a little bit. And then that makes it kind of phase in a pleasing sort of way. It is if you work the filter properly. Now, one other thing that this doesn't do very well is have that second filter, because in here you have one filter, but you also have filter 1 that passes through first. And I don't make use of that when using this controller, but it can do band pass and high pass. So, and it has its own cutoff and resonance. So I just leave these ones unassigned and just bypassed, because there's not enough controls here, and it's just that this synth with its own architecture doesn't match what this virtual analog polysynth can do. But Alternatively, if you wanted, you'd either have to mouse around on this editor, or you'd have to like hook up wirelessly an iPad, which has never been very reliable for me. So I like having just the basic controls over the synth. Really, what you would do if you wanted a bass synthesizer out of the Gemini is just use this thing itself, right? Because that's kind of what the 101 is for, right? So just use this thing. Like, don't use this blue thing as a controller. Use it as, take the audio out. That's all you need to do. But I just thought that was kind of amusing, because these boutiques, as useless as they are, because they're small and tiny and not very serious, that they're more in an instrument than a lot of cheap little things, because they've got they can send out values. This is all kind of digitally controlled. That I find it so cool that these little sliders can send out all of those values, and we use it as a controller to control something else like this. Anyways, that's all for today, and I don't know. See you in the next one, maybe. Bye.